You are standing within the marble courtyards of the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Imperial Rome, where emperors feasted on golden plates while screams echoed beneath the floors. Imagine a young servant dragged from the banquet hall, not for theft or treason, but for glancing too long at the wrong guest. She will not be executed in the streets where the public might pity her. Instead, she will vanish within the palace itself, her punishment witnessed only by trembling eyes forced to watch, ensuring that her silence becomes a lesson carved into living memory. The palace of Rome glittered under the Mediterranean sun, its mosaics reflecting the wealth of an empire that ruled continents, but the splendor was a thin veil over a machinery of fear. Within these marble walls, the emperor's word carried the weight of the gods, and every corridor hummed with suspicion. To serve in the imperial household was to live between luxury and terror, for the same hand that placed a wreath upon your head could sign the order for your destruction before nightfall. At feasts, the laughter of noblemen masked the careful surveillance of the Praetorian Guard who lined the walls, their polished armor catching the torchlight as they studied each servant, each noble, each concubine for the slightest breach of order. It was not always rebellion or crime that led to punishment. Often it was a mere hesitation, a falter in the voice, a gaze not properly lowered before the emperor's wife or favored guest. Such slips became the kindling for ruin. The palace was more than a residence, it was an instrument of discipline, where every punishment was calculated not simply to harm but to instruct. Rome understood that the body could be broken quickly, but the mind, when properly tortured, could serve as a lasting warning. Servants whispered of marble staircases that never echoed footsteps because those who once climbed them had been erased so completely that even memory hesitated to recall them. Slaves and nobles alike learned early that survival depended not upon loyalty but upon invisibility. To draw attention was to invite scrutiny, and to be scrutinized was often the beginning of the end. Punishments began not in dark chambers but in the open, staged within courtyards that gleamed like theaters of cruelty. The condemned were rarely told what crime they had committed, for confusion was itself a tool. Some were commanded to stand motionless through the heat of day and the chill of night, their trembling bodies a silent performance of submission, while others were paraded before their peers in chains of iron, forced to recite confessions whispered into them moments before. The true terror lay not in the lash or the chain, but in the uncertainty that hung over every witness. If one wrong word could destroy her, what would save me? This was the paradox of Rome's imperial palace. It promised glory and honor to those within its walls, yet it functioned as a trap that consumed beauty, talent, and loyalty with the same indifference. Above the colonnades, poets sang of empire and eternity, while below, broken voices carried warnings that never reached the streets. For to dwell here was to learn that Rome did not need to kill to erase you, it only needed to make you disappear, leaving others to fill the silence with obedience. They were not emperors, nor senators, nor generals, yet their shadow fell across every life within the palace. The Praetorian Guard, draped in polished armor and crimson cloaks, were the emperor's watchers, and their presence transformed Rome's most splendid residence into a place where silence became survival. These men were not stationed to protect. They were placed to observe, to record, and to extinguish the smallest spark of dissent before it ever reached flame. Their eyes moved over the marble floors with clinical precision, catching the nervous twitch of a servant's hand, the hesitation of a noblewoman's reply, the glances exchanged between slaves who dared to imagine themselves unseen. To be noticed by them was to feel the cold hand of ruin pressing down upon your shoulder. Yet the guards were not alone in this work. Behind the painted screens and in the echoing corridors lingered figures less visible but no less terrifying. Eunuchs and attendants whose entire lives were devoted to monitoring the private chambers of the palace. They held no sword, yet their reports could condemn. It was whispered that they could hear through stone, that they passed like shadows between walls, collecting whispers and sighs that would later be transformed into accusations. What made this system unbearable was not the act of punishment itself, but the knowledge that punishment could arrive for reasons no one could predict. Rome's rulers understood the power of uncertainty. One evening, a concubine might be favored with jewels and silks, her name spoken with tenderness. The next dawn, she could be stripped of everything, dragged through the colonnades by men whose faces betrayed no emotion. The palace watchers made no explanations. They had no need. Their silence was enough to unravel the minds of those who remained. For how could one prepare for survival when the rules shifted like sand beneath the Tiber's current? Every detail was recorded. The guards and eunuchs kept lists of behavior, inventories of words spoken, fragments of gestures noted in margins of wax tablets. They measured smiles at banquets, tracked the frequency of visits between chambers, and mapped the movements of slaves who carried messages through hidden corridors. These were not idle notes. They were death warrants written in waiting, each entry a seed that could be harvested when suspicion required blood. The most chilling part was the system of informants cultivated within the palace itself. Slaves were offered scraps of privilege to betray their companions. Friends were encouraged to expose friends. Even noble sons were taught to deliver whispers about their mothers and sisters. Rome had perfected the art of making survival dependent upon betrayal, ensuring that trust itself became the most dangerous act of all. To the emperor, the palace was a fortress of loyalty. To those who lived within it, it was a cage watched from every corner. Laughter at feasts became forced, conversations were measured in heartbeats, and even silence could be read as guilt. The watchers did not need to strike often. Their true weapon was fear, and fear ensured obedience long after the chains had been hidden away. In this way, the palace became not merely a home of rulers but a theater of surveillance, where the roles were fixed, the audience unwilling, and the ending always uncertain. The punishments of the palace were never hidden. They were designed to be seen, to be remembered, and to be whispered about long after the marble floors had been scrubbed clean of tears. Rome did not rely on secret cruelty, for secrecy bred defiance. Instead, the imperial palace became a stage where suffering itself was a performance, carefully arranged to remind every servant, concubine, and noble that the emperor's will was absolute. Within the courtyards, where the sun-illuminated gilded columns and fountains trickled in quiet beauty, the condemned were brought forth as actors in a play of fear. Their crimes were rarely announced, for explanation dulled the edge of terror. What mattered was the spectacle, the trembling figure forced to stand before an audience of those who would inevitably take the lesson to heart. It might begin with silence, a slave commanded to remain upright without food or rest, his body swaying under the gaze of dozens who watched with pity they dared not express. Or it might erupt with sound, the cracking of whips echoing against stone walls while the crowd of onlookers struggled to keep their expressions blank, knowing that a tear shed in sympathy could mark them for the same fate. The theater of fear was not confined to physical torment. Rome understood that humiliation could wound more deeply than lashes. Nobles who fell from favor were paraded through the halls in rags, their jewelry stripped away, their heads bowed not by force but by shame. Servants were forced to confess rehearsed lies, admitting to betrayals they never committed while the court looked on, absorbing the lesson that innocence was no shield. In these moments, the emperor did not always appear, for his absence was as powerful as his presence. The watchers carried out the display in his name, and those who survived it knew their lives were now bound by a silence more suffocating than chains. Perhaps the cruelest part of this theater was its unpredictability. A feast could be interrupted by the sudden arrival of guards, dragging a figure from the table to stand trial before their companions. Music would halt, goblets would still, and the hall itself seemed to breathe in anticipation. The condemned might be beaten, banished to the dungeons, or in rare cases executed swiftly, but the audience never knew which fate awaited until the final act. This uncertainty spread like poison. Each witness returned to their duties hollow-eyed, unable to shake the memory of what they had seen, and unable to predict when they themselves might be chosen to perform. In time, the palace itself absorbed these echoes of cruelty. Marble columns that had once symbolized triumph now stood as silent reminders of broken bodies. Courtyards became haunted by memories of wails that no amount of water could wash away. Rome's rulers had discovered a truth darker than the sword, that terror, when displayed as spectacle, was more enduring than death. And so the imperial palace became not just a home of emperors, but a stage where fear itself was the performance. and every soul within its walls played their part in silence. The body was Rome's most immediate canvas, and within the palace its rulers painted lessons upon flesh with precision and cruelty. To the outside world, the empire displayed triumphal arches, marble baths, and statues of gods carved in perfection, but within the imperial palace, bodies bore the scars of discipline. Punishments were chosen not only to cause pain, but to create permanent reminders, walking testaments of obedience branded into skin and bone. A servant who faltered in duty might not be killed, for death erased the lesson too quickly. Instead, he could be forced to stand for endless days in the atrium, denied food, denied rest, his legs swelling until his body shook like a reed in the wind. Others were scourged with whips braided from leather and iron, not in the arena for crowds of thousands, but in intimate courtyards where a few dozen trembling witnesses absorbed the sight in silence. The guards who carried out these punishments rarely spoke, for words were unnecessary when pain itself did the teaching. Rome understood that mutilation carried a heavier weight than execution. A tongue cut partially from a slave ensured he would never again spread rumors, but his stammering presence among the others kept fear alive. Tendons sliced in ankles prevented running, yet left the body living, dragging itself through duties as a shadow of what it once was. Fingers broken methodically were not just bones shattered, they were voices silenced, for those who could not write could not send messages beyond the palace walls. To strip a person of such simple abilities was to chain them more tightly than any set of iron. Yet the punishments were not always bloody. Starvation was a favorite tool, and prisoners could be kept alive on rations so small that their bodies wasted while their minds remained sharp enough to feel every moment of suffering. Others were branded with heated metal, the burn pressed against shoulders or arms, leaving marks that made escape impossible. Anyone beyond the palace who saw the scar knew instantly this was a soul who had belonged to the emperor, and the stain was more binding than shackles. Even bathing, once a symbol of Roman civilization, became a weapon. Some prisoners were plunged into icy waters for hours, their teeth chattering, their skin raw, while attendants looked on, reminding them that warmth was a privilege granted only at the emperor's whim. The cruelty of these punishments lay not only in their physical toll but in the staging. Victims were rarely hidden away. Their broken forms moved through the corridors, serving at banquets, carrying trays with trembling hands, limping across marble floors while nobles looked away. In this way, the palace turned every punished body into a living warning. Pain was not the end of punishment but the beginning, for the scar remained, the limp endured, the hollow eyes followed others like shadows that could not be banished. Rome's rulers had discovered a truth that outlived dynasties. A death silences one voice, but a broken body speaks forever. The cruelty of Rome did not end with the breaking of bones, for the body heals and scars fade, but the mind, once dismantled, could be turned into something more useful than a corpse. Deep beneath the palace lay chambers without windows, where air hung heavy and silence pressed against the skin until even the sound of one's own breath felt like a betrayal. Prisoners placed within these rooms were stripped not only of food and comfort but of their very identities. Names were taken, replaced with numbers, and soon the condemned no longer answered to who they had once been. Days passed in blackness until time itself dissolved, leaving men and women unable to recall whether they had been there a week, a month, or a year. This dislocation was the point, for a soul unmoored from memory became malleable, a vessel waiting to be filled with obedience. Isolation was among the most feared punishments, more terrifying than whips or chains, for the victim was forced to sit alone with their thoughts until those thoughts turned against them. Some clawed the stone walls until their fingers bled, desperate to prove they still existed. Others began speaking aloud, inventing voices to fill the void, until they no longer recognized which words were their own. When eventually released back into the palace, these hollow figures were not rebels broken by force but creatures emptied of will, smiling when commanded, bowing without hesitation, shadows of the people they once were. Rome called this correction, but those who witnessed it called it madness. Humiliation was another weapon sharpened for the mind. Servants were made to confess crimes they never committed, their lies rehearsed until they sounded like truth. Some were forced to wear signs, declaring their shame, paraded through the palace corridors, while others pretended not to look. The knowledge that innocence was no protection carved deep wounds into every heart, for if confession could be demanded at any time, then guilt was no longer tied to action but to survival. Others were subjected to cruel manipulations of hope. Promises of freedom or favor were dangled before them, only to be withdrawn at the final moment. To be raised toward deliverance and then hurled back into despair left the spirit fractured more surely than any lash across the back. The palace also devised elaborate tests to unmask affections, for emotional bonds were considered threats to imperial order. A whisper of friendship could be weaponized, and so guards staged false emergencies, watching to see who rushed to help whom. When bonds were revealed, punishment fell not only upon the guilty but upon those they loved, teaching every witness that to care was to endanger. Slowly, trust evaporated, and the palace became a world where no hand reached out without trembling. This was the genius of Rome's cruelty. It did not need chains to hold its servants. It held them in webs of uncertainty, humiliation, and isolation until they themselves became their own jailers. The mind was reshaped, the will dissolved, and the lesson endured long after the punishment ended. In the palace of Rome, the cruelest punishment was not the lash, nor the iron, nor even the silent chambers beneath the earth, but the slow destruction of trust. Emperors and their watchers understood that no rebellion could grow in soil where friendship had been salted away, and so the palace became a place where every bond was tested until it broke. Slaves were taught that loyalty to a companion was dangerous, for affection could be twisted into a weapon. Brothers betrayed brothers, lovers turned informants, and mothers were forced to choose between silence and the safety of their children. A single whispered promise of freedom or privilege was enough to loosen tongues, and in this way the palace reshaped ordinary human love into instruments of control. To survive was to betray, and to refuse betrayal was to die. The rituals of exposure were coldly calculated. Guards might spread a false rumor of an escape attempt, then watch carefully to see who warned whom. A servant who whispered a warning to a friend revealed himself, and both would be punished, one for daring to act, the other for daring to care. In another instance, prisoners were told their companion had already confessed, and the choice was simple: confirm the story and live, or deny it and perish. In most cases, lies piled upon lies until no one could tell what was true, and the bonds that once held people together dissolved under the acid of suspicion. Yet the most horrifying element was how punishment extended beyond the guilty. A slave who showed kindness to another could be forced to watch as that very person was beaten or starved, the message clear that compassion itself carried a price. Affection became a crime, and indifference the only path to survival. Over time, even gestures of comfort, an arm across a shoulder, a hand brushed against another, vanished from the palace, leaving men and women surrounded by hundreds of others, yet more alone than if they had been locked away in darkness. For nobles and courtiers, betrayal took on a more theatrical form. Entire families could be torn apart by accusations, with one member raised in favor while another was destroyed. Emperors encouraged siblings to report on each other, ensuring that even blood could not shield one from suspicion. This practice hollowed out families and left the court filled with orphans of loyalty, children who had learned too young that survival meant turning in those they loved most. Nothing was sacred in the palace, not love, not blood, not friendship, for all could be purchased, tested, and shattered. What remained in the wake of this betrayal was worse than emptiness. It was a silence filled with the knowledge that no one could be trusted, that every word might be carried to ears waiting in the shadows. People began to censor even their own thoughts, fearing that a glance or hesitation might betray feelings they could no longer hide. In this way, the palace perfected its cruelty. It made its prisoners complicit in their own oppression, forcing them to sacrifice the very bonds that gave life meaning. To break the body was easy, but to break trust was to break the soul, leaving behind not rebels, not companions, but solitary figures moving through marble halls like ghosts, condemned not by their enemies, but by the ones they once held dear. The punishments reserved for the gravest offenses within Rome's palace were not simple executions, for death was too merciful, too swift, and left no enduring mark on the minds of those who remained. These ultimate measures, called by some the final corrections, were rituals of annihilation, designed to strip a person not only of life but of dignity, memory, and meaning. When an attendant was suspected of treason, when a concubine was rumored to have grown too close to the emperor, or when a courtier whispered alliances in dark corners, their end was crafted as a performance of terror. The condemned were paraded before others still living, displayed as cautionary figures whose downfall carried lessons sharper than any blade. Some were sealed alive in coffins, their muffled cries echoing down marble corridors as they were carried past companions who were forbidden to look away. Others were bound within weighted sacks and lowered silently into the Tiber, their final struggle hidden beneath the current, but burned into the imaginations of every witness who had heard the splash. The cruelty lay not only in what was done, but in how it was made to be seen. A concubine who once believed herself favored might be forced to watch another take her place in the emperor's bed, her tears greeted with cold silence. A noble who thought himself untouchable might be dressed in rags and paraded before the same crowd that had once cheered his titles. Each act was staged with precision, the humiliation deepened by the presence of those who would carry the memory like a wound. For the victims, the end came slowly, but for the survivors, it lingered forever. Rome's rulers knew that blood spilled in secret inspired martyrs, but blood spilled in ritual erased resistance altogether. The final corrections did not merely remove enemies, they rewrote the thoughts of everyone who remained. To see a companion erased so completely was to feel the weight of silence settle over every word, every glance, every secret thought. And so the palace endured, not only by swords and guards, but by a theater of fear, in which the final act was always despair. The ruins of the Palatine Hill gleam in the Roman sun, their broken arches and scattered stones drawing the gaze of travelers who come to marvel at the remnants of empire. Yet for those who once lived within these walls, the memory was not of triumph, but of fear. Behind the marble columns and golden mosaics, the palace had perfected the art of silence, crafting a world where obedience was not requested but carved into the mind through suffering. Every courtyard had heard the cries of the condemned, every corridor had carried whispers that could mean death, and every chamber had once held secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. What endures today is beauty, but beneath that beauty lingers the shadows of those whose names were erased, whose bodies were broken, and whose souls were stripped bare in the name of order. The most haunting legacy of Rome's palace punishments is not found in the records of executions but in the absence of voices. For the empire understood that true power lay not in killing, but in ensuring that those who survived carried the memory of fear in their blood, passing it silently to the next generation. It is said that even after release, servants and nobles alike never spoke of what they had witnessed, their silence becoming a second punishment that followed them beyond the palace walls. To walk free was not to be free, for their dreams remained haunted by the screams they dared not remember by day. As the centuries crumbled the empire, the stones of the palace outlasted the men and women who once trembled within them. Yet if one listens in the stillness of those ruins, when tourists have gone and the evening light falls across the hill, there is a sense that the echoes have never fully faded. Rome may have celebrated its emperors with statues and triumphal arches, but its true legacy is written in the shadows of the palace, where the price of obedience was measured not only in blood, but in silence. And as we stand among those ruins today, we are reminded that beneath every empire's splendor lies a theater of fear, and that the cost of absolute power is always paid in human souls. If these shadows of Rome still echo in your mind, then the path is clear. Subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next descent into history's darkest secrets.